Ever seen one of those faded no dumping signs by the side of the road? You know, the kind half hidden by weeds warning you not to trash the place. Right. Makes you think, who would even do that?
Yeah? Haha.
Well, get ready for a mind shift. Because today's deep dive is all about how a certain kind of dumping, a much bigger systemic kind, might be hardwired into the US itself. That's right. We're going deep into this excerpt from The State and Policy to examine how intertwined the United States is with practices that harm both the environment and social equality. It's almost like the system itself is set up to, well, dump on certain people and places. Yeah, and this source does not hold back. No, it argues that imperialism, environmental racism, it's all baked into the DNA of how things work.
It really is.
Before we get too disheartened, though, how about we break down the theories they use to explain it all?
Okay, good.
Starting with the Treadmill of Production.
Okay.
I'll be honest, that one sounds a little intimidating.
Don't worry, it's actually a very useful way of understanding how capitalism's endless pursuit of profit creates this vicious cycle. Imagine a hamster wheel. More production means more need for resources, more pollution, and often more exploitation of workers. It's all about keeping those profits rolling in, even if it means cutting corners on environmental protections or worker safety.
And this source connects that directly to what happened after World War II.
Exactly, you had this huge boom in industry which required massive amounts of resources and cheap labour. This is where you see the rise of things like outsourcing and the decline of unions, all to keep those profits high. The problem is, this often came at the expense of the environment and marginalised communities.
Okay.
For example, think about factories being built in poorer communities, exposing residents to higher levels of pollution.
Which leads us to our next theory, environmental justice studies.
So we've got this treadmill turning away, but who's actually getting trampled by it?
This is where things get really personal. Environment and justice studies shines a light on how marginalised communities, often communities of colour or low-income communities, disproportionately bear the brunt of environmental harms.
We're talking toxic waste dumps near homes, higher rates of asthma in neighbourhoods without access to green spaces. The list goes on.
Absolutely. And often, these communities have the least amount of political power to fight back against these injustices. That's why the term environmental racism is used. It highlights the direct link between racialized groups and environmental harm. The goal of environmental justice is to fight for a world where everyone, regardless of their background, has the right to a clean, healthy environment.
It's almost like some people end up living in a completely different environment than others, simply because of their racialized group or economic status.
Yeah. Which connects to that third theory mentioned in the source, Risk Society by Ulrich Beck.
Right.
I have to admit that one went a little over my head at first.
It's a big concept, but think of it this way. Modern societies create these huge environmental risks: nuclear power, industrial chemicals, climate change, things that can have devastating consequences. Beck argued that we often deal with these risks not by actually solving them, but by shifting the burden onto those deemed less valuable or less powerful.
So we're not talking about individual choices here, but about how entire systems are set up to protect some while exposing others.
Exactly. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth about imperialism and how it factors into this equation.
Right, because it's not just about conquering land anymore. It's about controlling resources and dictating the terms of global trade. Yeah. So how does this source tie US imperialism into environmental harm? It starts with something called the Monroe Doctrine.
Now, I vaguely remember that from history class. Wasn't it supposed to be a good thing?
Well, it's complicated. On the surface, the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared in 1823, was positioned as a way to protect the Americas from European colonialism. But in reality, it became the nation-state's way of claiming its own sphere of influence, especially in Latin America. So protection with some very specific strings attached.
Exactly. And the source really drives this point home with a quote, "American ideals of freedom too quickly turn into a predilection for conquest." In other words, the pursuit of resources and economic dominance often overshadowed any supposed good intentions.
Which is where that very vivid image from the source comes in. The one by Eduardo Galeano about the open veins of Latin America. That really stuck with me.
It's a powerful metaphor for how the region's resources have been extracted to fuel the US and other global powers, often leaving behind environmental devastation and social inequality.
It's like we're talking about vampires sucking countries dry, except instead of blood, it's oil, minerals, cheap labour. And this isn't just ancient history either. The source makes it clear that this pattern of exploitation continues to have real-world consequences today.
Absolutely. Think about the current debates around immigration and the refugee crisis. People fleeing countries ravaged by poverty and violence. But how often do we acknowledge the role of US foreign policy, of economic exploitation, in creating those very conditions?
It's easy to forget that history isn't really over. It's still shaping the world around us. And this is where things take an even darker turn, right? Because the source goes on to explain how this pattern of taking what isn't yours is actually embedded in the legal foundations of the United States, starting with something called the Doctrine of Discovery. To be honest, I'd never even heard of it before.
It's not exactly taught in history classes, and it's a pretty unsettling chapter. Basically, European explorers used this doctrine, which dates back to the 15th century, to justify claiming lands that were already inhabited by indigenous peoples. They argued that by discovering these lands, they had the right to claim them for their own crowns, even if people were already living there.
Wait, so just showing up meant they could claim ownership? What about the people who already called those lands home?
That's the crux.
Wow.
The Doctrine of Discovery completely disregarded the rights and sovereignty of indigenous peoples.
Right.
And what's even more disturbing is how this thinking made its way into US law, specifically through the Marshall Doctrine.
Okay, more legal jargon. Break that down for me.
So this comes from a Supreme Court case in 1823, Johnson v. McIntosh, where Chief Justice John Marshall essentially adapted the Doctrine of Discovery for the US context. He argued that while Native American tribes were considered nations, they were a domestic dependent type of nation existing within the overarching sovereignty of the United States.
So basically saying, you're nations, but we're the landlord, and we make the
rules. That's a great way to put it. This created a power imbalance that allowed the US government to claim ultimate authority over Native American lands and resources. The Marshall Doctrine set the stage for centuries of land dispossession, forced assimilation, and environmental exploitation.
And the source digs into some specific examples of how this played out, like the Dawes Act, which, if I'm remembering correctly, was supposed to be about helping Native Americans.
That was the narrative, yes. Passed in 1887, the Dawes Act aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society by breaking up communally held tribal lands into individual allotments. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a reasonable idea, dividing up the land amongst the people.
Right, giving everyone their own little slice of the pie.
Exactly, but the devil, as they say, is in the details.
Yeah.
The real goal was to dismantle tribal sovereignty and open up those lands for settlement by non-natives. It was a land grab disguised as progress.
It was a setup from the beginning. That's infuriating. But even the land that Native Americans were left with after the Dawes Act, it wasn't like it was protected, was it?
Unfortunately not. The Marshall Doctrine had established this legal framework where resources on Native American lands, timber, minerals, even water, were essentially up for grabs if the US government decided they were needed. And the agency tasked with overseeing all of this, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, doesn't exactly have a great track record when it comes to looking out for the best interests of Native Americans.
We've all heard the stories about the BIA. It's like they were working against the very people they were supposed to be helping.
That's putting it mildly. The source mentions how the BIA often failed to ensure environmental protections during resource extraction projects on or near native lands. The result? Widespread pollution, contamination of water sources, and serious health problems in many of these communities.
It's like this never-ending cycle of injustice. Listen, I know uranium is dangerous, but what's the connection to native lands?
It's a chilling example of environmental racism. During the Cold War, uranium mining was essential for developing nuclear weapons. And guess where a lot of that mining took place? On or near Native American reservations. The government needed uranium, and these lands were seen as expendable.
So, they were willing to risk the health and well-being of entire communities in the name of national security.
That's the horrifying reality. And the legacy of that decision is still felt today. Many native communities are dealing with the devastating effects of radioactive contamination, increased cancer rates, birth defects, poisoned water sources, and who bears the brunt of it? The very people least responsible for the decisions that led to it.
It's heartbreaking to think about these communities being treated as expendable. It makes you wonder, how can we possibly untangle something so deeply woven into the fabric of our country? This isn't just history, it's happening right now, right?
Absolutely.
A powerful example mentioned in the source is the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Oh, right, that was huge. Yeah, I remember following that on the news. It felt like a real turning point.
It was. The Standing Rock protests weren't just about a pipeline. They were about protecting sacred lands and water resources, about tribal sovereignty in the face of corporate power. What's more, they helped connect these struggles to the larger issue of climate change.
Right, and I remember people like Bill McKibben, who's usually talking about the global climate crisis, showing up at Standing Rock. It really brought together different groups and issues.
It's all connected. The source also brings up the case of native Hawaiians. Did you know that Hawaii, though not known for large industrial operations, has hazardous waste sites that pose serious environmental issues? Improper waste handling threatens the state's vulnerable ecosystems, adversely affecting marine life and local wildlife. And a lot of the hazardous waste stems from military activities.
Wow, I had no idea. I guess when we think of Hawaii, we picture paradise, not toxic waste dumps.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that environmental injustice can impact anyone, even in a place we consider a tropical paradise. It raises the question of who gets to live in those pristine environments and who ends up bearing the burden of pollution and contamination.
It makes you think about the whole concept of environmental privilege, right? Not everyone has the luxury of worrying about where their food comes from or whether the air they breathe is clean.
It's a crucial point. Environmental privilege means that certain groups benefit from a healthy environment at the expense of others, often without even realizing it.
It's almost like this invisible hierarchy, where some people get to be shielded from the worst of it.
Right.
But the source does offer some hope, right?
That's right. And what's really encouraging is that these movements understand that this isn't just a local issue. They recognize that environmental issues transcend national borders and require global solutions.
Because pollution doesn't need a passport, and neither does climate change.
Exactly. We're all sharing this planet. The source highlights the principles of environmental justice, which came out of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit back in 1991. It's a powerful document.
And what do those principles say? What are they calling for?
They lay out a vision for a just and sustainable future for everyone, not just a select few. A world where everyone has the right to a clean and healthy environment, regardless of race, class, or where they live. It calls for self-determination, holding polluters accountable, and recognizing the interconnectedness of social justice and environmental protection.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, like these problems are just too big to solve.
That's where the source leaves us with a truly radical idea. It asks us to question if maybe, just maybe, the very structure of the nation-state, the way we organize power and prioritize self-interest, is inherently incompatible with true environmental justice.
Hold on. So it's not just about tweaking the system, it's about reimagining the entire thing. That's a pretty huge idea to think about.
It is, but that's the power of this kind of deep dive, isn't it? It pushes us to confront uncomfortable truths and grapple with big, complex questions.
So what does this all mean for you, dear listener? It's not easy to face these harsh realities, but knowledge is power. We hope this deep dive has given you a new understanding of how environmental harm and social injustice are intertwined, how historical patterns continue to shape our present and maybe even spark some hope that change is possible.
Because if we want a world where everyone has clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and a healthy planet to call home, we need to be willing to question everything, to demand better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
It's time to move beyond the no dumping signs and start building a world where everyone has the right to a clean and healthy environment. A world where we're not dumping on each other but lifting each other up. That's something worth fighting for.